Okay, hello everyone. Sorry for the late start. I think when the sun's shining, we're always a bit slower to get going. But we're very grateful to see you all here and we're very excited about our event. I feel a little bit like we're preaching to the choir a bit here because having been here for just 2 weeks, I've noticed how many of you are studying in England, have spent time in Britain, in Scotland, and you know a lot about the country. So for this part of the event, we're going to try and avoid some of the old cliches, bad weather, the Queen, tea, and we're going to focus a bit more on Britain in transition and what kind of culture we've got today. We want to focus a bit more on how Britain is changing within Europe, but also in the world, and what kind of role it might be playing. So we're very lucky today. We've got two wonderful speakers from the art world in Berlin, so they're going to be coming and speaking to us later. But first of all, we've got our very own Edward, who's going to be talking to us about culture in transition, and is going to give a wonderful speech. So.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Fantastic. All right, well, I have to admit that when I was asked to give this speech, I was slightly perplexed, might be the best word to use, since I grew up in a county called Hampshire. It's very rural, and so I don't have much in the way of first-hand experience to do with immigration in Britain or cultural transfers. And so I thought, well, if I can't really offer anything in the way of insightful first-hand experience, observations, or anecdotes, I might instead try and offer some context to the debate that's going to be going on over this evening, perhaps in the historical and political sense. So as you can see, it's going to be Britain. Is it a culture in transition or a transitional culture? And so what I mean by that is the cultural shift taking place in Britain at the moment a unique historical event, or is it simply part of a pattern of British history which is going on as long as British history itself has been in existence? Excellent. Do you want to? Okay. And so I thought I'd start with a very brief whip round, like a very brief timeline of English history. This is going to be like a best of reel, so it's very superficial and not very in-depth, but hopefully you'll get some broader understanding of the issues at hand. So every story has to start somewhere, so I thought I'd start mine with the collapse of the Roman Empire. As greater strain was placed upon the empire, you had the Roman legions and the Roman support structure abandoning what could be deemed as the original indigenous population of Britain, which is the Celts and the Picts, triggering, which is perhaps one of the biggest mass migrations in English history, from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. Specifically, you had three tribes. You had the Jutes, you had the Angles, and you had the Saxons. And it is in this mass migration that England actually got its name. There were so many Angles in England, in Britain, that it became known as the land of the Angles, or Angle land, which eventually transformed into England. So a fun or not so fun fact for all of you here. And so, moving into the medieval period, as I said, completely, like, as fast as possible, blitzing this. I'm just talking about two specific kings and the trends which they set. From 1016, Britain was conquered by a man called King Canute, who was also king of Ireland, Norway, Sweden, all of Denmark. And so this can be seen to establish what is very like the long tradition, or if not the royal precedent in Britain, of being ruled by kings and queens which are not in themselves culturally English or share the same culture as the bulk of the native population. King Canute himself ruled from 1016 to about 1034. There was a brief window of return of control to the Anglo-Saxon population before the gentleman on the right, or whatever, stepped in. His name is William the Conqueror. He conquered England in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Now, what's interesting, the one point I want to make about this, is that he established the precedent of England's elite and aristocracy and royal family speaking French for the next few hundred years. It was not until Edward III came along, hundreds of years later, that English Anglo-Saxon was not even recognized as a language in any political sense of the term. So for the longest time, it was French was the lingua franca of the kingdom. Just keep going across. Okay, awesome. And then keeping with the French theme, because why not, I thought I'd talk about the French Huguenots. And so in the early modern period, you had an awful lot of religious unrest in Europe. You had the rise of Protestantism, the birth of Protestantism, and French Huguenots themselves were French Protestants. And approximately 50,000 fled to London alone trying to escape religious persecution in their respective country. And they're simply a typical example. You have Protestants fleeing to Britain from all over the place. And so you can perhaps describe this as the first refugee wave to England in its history. And so I said about approximately 50,000 in London alone. The statistic is approximately a quarter of London's present-day population can trace their ancestry back to this Huguenot migration. And perhaps a less negative, but no less controversial topic is that of Indian migration. Most people think that Indian migration began after the Second World War, post-war migration. However, approximately 1.5 million Indians fought for Great Britain in the First World War. And out of that, approximately 30,000 decided to stay in Great Britain itself. So perhaps the first great wave of Indian migration to Britain is a lot earlier than we traditionally think. And finally, and this is probably the most relevant wave of migration, this is the one which the repercussions of we're still feeling today. It's an ongoing process, and this is post-war migration. The photo which I've put up here is of the Empire Windrush, which is the ship which brought the first wave of West Indies, so people from the Caribbean, to Great Britain. And so it's it was a turning point in our history because it was very much the start, the opening of a new era in British migration. I'd quite like to mention the fact that originally it's an awful lot of people like to paint this as Britain opening its doors to its imperial subjects as soon as the war was over. But initially they were very keen on only white, only European, only immigration, but that couldn't fill the labour gap left by the Second World War. And so only then was it decided that imperial subjects could move to Britain. So it's not as adopted as readily as we'd like to think. So where does this leave us? The pie chart behind me is of a census taken, I believe, in 2011. And it shows that there's still, despite all these waves of migration, there is still very much, it's a very one-sided demographic culture. It's still 86% are classified as white British. However, I think what I've been trying to establish in this timeline is that in itself is a very nebulous and hard to define term if we're talking about ethnicity, etc. Can we move on? Yeah. Awesome. So why is this relevant? And I thought I'd quite like to quickly explain why this historical precedent, which I've briefly skimmed over, could be used to perhaps describe or at least touch upon some of the current attitudes and legislation which exists in Britain today in regards to legislation. So I'd like to do a quote. I am cherry picking here, but it was quite a tidy quote. This is by Queen Victoria. Who's simply stating, can I move this? Yeah, we disclaim the right and desire to impose our convictions on any of our subjects. We declare it to be our royal will and pleasure that none be in any wise favoured, none molested or disquieted by reason of their religious faith or observances, but that all shall alike enjoy the equal and impartial protection of the law. This was Queen Victoria, a 19th century British monarch. Do you want to move along? And I'd like to compare this to the French equivalent, which is a man by, I think his name was Gentry de Bussy. And he's essentially saying that is the duty of France being further along the civilizational road, as he phrases it, to educate and raise up its subject population. And so it's it's considered an outdated precedent in the modern world, but it was very much the forefront of French colonial thought. And so my thoughts regarding this, and this was very much a distinction between British imperial and French imperial colonial policy. And it's one question which I'd like to throw out to the room is that in France today, it is illegal to wear the veil in public spaces. You can't wear it in libraries, you can't wear it in schools, and you can't wear it in government offices. However, in Great Britain, no such political debate has entered into our mainstream politics, really in any serious way. And so perhaps this is a topic for the roundtable discussion. How much can our respective histories explain our differences in immigration? And yeah, I'd just quite like to summarize with this quote by a Nigerian Nobel laureate in 1984, who's essentially suggesting that the imperial project made Britain arrogant, but arrogant in the sense of a silver lining existed, in that the British elite especially, I wouldn't be so audacious as to pretend that the entire imperial population was this welcoming, tolerant, group friendly and open to all cultures. The racism definitely existed and was very much enforced. However, he seems to be suggesting that this arrogance towards accommodation, that the British viewed themselves as the most open, and that became a form of pride. And so I'd just like to throw two questions out to the room, not now, but in the panel discussion, so perhaps bear these in mind. So to what extent what are the benefits and flaws of the British attitude of benign neglect? So the idea that as long as you don't interfere with imperial policy, we will leave you and your culture alone. There are definitely pros and cons to this. Perhaps the possible con that I can think off the top of my head is that it builds no tools for cultural dialogue or integration. So by the time post-war immigration finally comes about, the vast bulk of the British population has no cultural tools available to them to actually integrate and interact with this new population. And yes, I'd just quickly, perhaps a bit more light-hearted, talk about the two-way street. So especially in England, there's a lot of debate about how far the immigrant should have to adapt, how far should they learn English, should they adapt our values, our societal outlook. However, I was quite curious to point out the feedback on this. The fact that the host society is also moulded and changed. And so I thought I'd use Rasta Mouse. Rasta Mouse is a show which my nephew loves. He adores it to death. It's a children's show that is very popular in England. The synopsis is Rasta Mouse and his band of friends, otherwise known as the Easy Crew, are a group of crime-fighting mice that solve crimes in their neighborhood and in their spare time play reggae music. So do you want to click on there? And so, yeah, and quickly, the photo by the side of the video is of the two co-creators, and I thought, again, that neatly summed up the point that I was trying to make. It's co-created between an author and writer by the name of Genevieve Webster and a Rastafarian swimming instructor who works in Kensington by the name of Michael de Souzy, I believe. And so I thought this was, again, a fantastic example of cultural synthesis taking place in Great Britain. Again, Hoos, can you...
Rasta Mouse and Scratchy and Zuma, also known as the Easy Crew. Crime fighters, they're very speculated, playing reggae when the work is true. Give it up, give it up, give it up for the Easy Crew. Solving mysteries in the neighborhood, always there to make a bad thing good.
So, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I very quickly wanted to brush over this. I think this was perhaps the most hard work in terms of the topic. And so, do you want to press the side button again? This is the politics of transition. I only really wanted to talk about how these migrant communities are being represented in today's world. And so this was a very quick survey done of MPs, and it turns out there are only 27 MPs. In 2013, this survey was taken, who can be described of an immigrant background. And so it's perhaps the point I'm trying to make is that more work needs to be done. And so, yes, you do have this cultural synthesis, but there are still very much problems. And I think that the immigrant communities in Great Britain are underrepresented. I showed you the chart beforehand, and while they didn't make up a huge percentage of the British population, 27 MPs is still not representative of that populational chunk, especially given the fact that Britain has the most representatives in its parliament, the second most. Only China has more members sitting in its lower house than Great Britain, so it's a massive amount of MPs, and an awful lot of them do not come from like a diverse background. Thank you. And so I thought I'd just leave you with some closing thoughts. This is a quote, this is text found on a monument at Battle Abbey. This is where Battle of Hastings took place. So the photo of that dashing chap, William the Conqueror, I showed you earlier. This is where he won. He beat the Saxon king, King Harold Godwinson, and became King of England. And instead of a commemoration or a commiseration of this English defeat, this is what you find. This stone has been set in place to commemorate the fusion of the English and Norman peoples, which resulted from the great battle fought here in 1066. And so the point, if you take anything away from this long rambling deluge that I've given you, it's the idea that this is not a unique phenomenon. It is something that has been going on in many shapes and sizes for at least 1,000 years of English history and culture. And so perhaps like a closing remark is that many people, as an insult levied by some at the English or the British as a whole, is that they are a mongrel peoples. And I personally take pride in this, the idea that we can assimilate, we can welcome, and we can change to accommodate new ideas, better ideas, new ways of doing things. And I'd just like to point out that it's the purebreds, the pedigrees, that end up suffering from genetic diseases caused by inbreeding, and not the mongrels. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. That was a really brilliant introduction to our topic. We're very lucky next to be able to welcome Rebecca Culverhouse. Rebecca was born in Burnley in Lancashire, and she's come here today to talk to us about some of her work she's been doing in the film industry. So Rebecca was very interested in film from a very early age, having made her first minor film at the age of 7, I think. She then studied philosophy at the University of York, but still remained very active in the University Film Society and carried on with the filmmaking. After studying, she moved to Japan for 3 years, where she taught English, but was also very involved in making films there, made a big group of like-minded individuals who also were involved in the filmmaking. She came back to England, and we're going to hear a bit about her experiences in London. And she's been living in Berlin since November. So if we could give a warm welcome, please, to Rebecca.
So yeah, I always wanted to be a filmmaker. It's the only thing I've ever really known I've wanted to do. And because of that, I've known that I've always had to move to London. When you are in the UK, there is London and there is not London. So it's the cultural epicenter of the UK, basically. It drives the nation's finance, government, and media. So I knew I had to get there. I was living in my mum's house after coming back from Tokyo. My plan was get a job, save up lots of money, move to London, and begin my amazing career as a filmmaker. But in Rawtenstall, this Lancashire town, there was no work, no jobs, not even bar work. You couldn't get anything. So in the end, I just thought, okay, I'm just going to go to London and see what happens. So yeah, I went to seek my fortune, basically. I found somewhere to live within a week. It was in Leighton, which is near the Olympic area. It's kind of a bit of a rundown area, so rooms were cheap, which was good for me. And within a week, I'd set up a screening of one of my short films that I made in uni. And it was going to be screened before a feature film at a horror event. And my film was about mysterious, creepy people that you might find on the streets if you wander out at night. And the feature film was Let the Right One In, which is about vampires who might attack you if you go onto the streets at night. And it was very spooky, it was fun. After the screening, the lights went up and the organizers came to the front of the room and they said, we didn't want to disturb the film, but while you've been watching the film, riots have broken out all over London. It's actually really dangerous to go on the streets right now, so whatever plans you had, just cancel them, just go home, just be safe. And me and my friends weren't quite sure, was this true? Was this a prank? Because it kind of fit in with the horror theme. But they showed us live BBC footage of burning buildings, people wearing hoodies, charging across the streets. And we were kind of shocked, this was London, what's going on? It looked like a war zone. So we went home, and I was really surprised because the streets were actually silent. I couldn't see any burning buildings, no smoke. I couldn't hear shouts or broken glass. I was the only person on the streets of London. It was really bizarre. And I actually felt like I was in a zombie film. So it was a very surreal experience. And when I got home, I switched on the BBC again. And again, there were all these images, burning buildings, burning streets, people screaming, running around. And it was very different to my experience of what I'd just seen. And my parents were obviously really worried. They were calling me, like, are you okay? Like, you've just moved to London. And I had to tell them, actually, it's fine where I am. Like, I've seen nothing. There's like one broken window. So it was a lot less dramatic than the media made it look. So that was my first week in London. It was a really dramatic introduction to the city, but everything settled down, calmed down. And a few months went by, and I applied to make a music video for a really cool band called United Vibrations. They're a really positive band. They have a really conscious way of living. They really think about how their music, how their behavior will affect the community, will affect the environment. So I really, really wanted to work with them. And I sent my portfolio, and they liked it. And they told me about their track. It's called London Bridge. And it's basically was written before the riots happened, but it really reflects, I think, British people's feelings about the government and about being young and in Britain, because more and more there feels like there's a difference between the people who govern the country and the people who are governed. It feels like there's a big disconnect. So this track, London Bridge, felt really relevant. And at the same time, there was a peaceful protest called Occupy St. Paul's. It was made at the same time as Occupy Wall Street, where people camped out in front of these famous locations and wanted to raise awareness against corporate greed, economic inequality, things like that. And they invited the band to come and do a gig there. So we thought, okay, let's make a music video of this, let's film them. So we just went out, very documentary style, guerrilla style. We just filmed them busking at this outside St. Paul's Cathedral. There were people in their tents who'd been sleeping there night after night. And it was really nice for them to have a bit of a break and some music. And then we also went and filmed them playing on London Bridge. And that was a completely different atmosphere because that's the main place where commuters walk to get home after a really busy day at work. And these people are trying to make a living in London. They're working really hard within the system. And they were not interested in seeing a band play. They weren't interested in hearing music. They just wanted to get straight home. So there's a really interesting mix between the people at St. Paul's who are all standing around listening and the people just walking past on London Bridge. So I'm going to show you a short clip of the video. The whole video is about 9 minutes long, but I've just done a 4-minute clip. And I think it really sums up the atmosphere of what London was like at the time, a really unsettled kind of tension going on and a kind of feeling that change could happen, and it could happen from the people and not just from the government. Yeah.
trainers.
Yeah, so that's the first 4 minutes, and then it's quite a long music video, so if you like, you can come and find me after, and you can find out the link to watch the rest of it. So that was basically my first professional job as a filmmaker, and it was also a really interesting time experiencing the riots and the craziness of London. So, yep.
So, now we've got one of our cousins from across the pond. We're very fortunate today to have Daniel Brunet. Daniel was born in Syracuse in New York State, and he studied theatre and film at Boston College. He came to Berlin in 2001 on a Fulbright grant, and started working a little later as associate director and producer of German theatre. Which was German theatre abroad, which is international movement between New York and Berlin. And he's now working full-time in Berlin, I understand. Since 2012, he's producing artistic director of English theatre, Berlin International Performing Arts Centre. And he's been doing a lot of work in Kreuzberg, so has a different kind of perspective on an international environment, multicultural cities. So we're hoping to hear a little bit about that from him.
Well, thank you very much again for the invitation to speak. Picking up on terms of interculturalism, cultures in transition, I keep finding myself thinking that to begin to discuss the present, particularly within the context of the last 500 years in the Western world, we need to first begin by looking back to the past and the era of European colonialism, which seems to have indelibly influenced the appearances, populations, and cultures of almost every city worldwide, and certainly and most predominantly in Europe itself. We heard from Edward about Britain's immigration and migration history. Something that I've found really interesting in my own research over the last few years has been Germany's wholesale demographic transformation within the second half of the 20th century. That started first and foremost with the divided city of West Berlin, which began in 1961 a guest worker program, a Gastarbeiter program, primarily with the nations of Italy and Turkey, with the result that today Berlin, Germany features the world's third largest urban Turkish population, outmatched only by Istanbul and Ankara. East Berlin, in turn, had its own immigration history, having numerous agreements with numerous politically allied states, including Vietnam, Mozambique, Angola, Cuba, with the result that there is still a Vietnamese German community of over 100,000 people in the former East. Now, I work primarily in the fields of theater and performance. Theater and performance, like all arts, I think, are intended to give a community a chance to meet, come together, and explore itself through stories. This ties hand in hand with the interesting fact that the most produced playwright in Germany today is someone, in fact, not of German origin, but of British origin, William Shakespeare. Even though this playwright wrote his plays 400 years ago, the amount of time, the gaps that have passed between then and now have rendered this material so open that not only in Germany, but the world over, these stories, themselves taken from traditional sources, have become malleable enough to reflect diverse communities and their stories. One thing that to reflect diverse communities and their stories. Now, as we move into the 21st century, as the barriers towards communication, travel, and residency become smaller and smaller, we see demographies increasingly and indelibly change. One way that they've changed in Germany is, as I've said, it has become a net immigrant nation. In the 2013 immigration rankings, Germany came in third before the United States and Russia. And something that's very exciting is that this new diversity in the Federal Republic is finally becoming evidence within the stages of the capital city and throughout the Republic. One of the biggest initiatives for this was in 2008 when the city founded an organization called Bauhaus Naunienstraße. Bauhaus Naunienstraße was an answer to the fact that although Berlin featured a very large urban Turkish population, now in its third generation of integration, there was still not a stage dedicated to these stories. A woman named Sherman Longhof, herself the daughter of Turkish guest worker immigrants, was chosen to lead this institution, which became a self-styled post-migratory theater, not interested in telling Turkish stories for a still Turkish population in Germany, but instead interested in seeing the new generations as fully fledged Germans and simply telling stories of people who happen to have a migratory background. Not for nothing, although people wouldn't think so, Germany now features a population where 1 in 5 people come from a so-called immigration background. In 2012, as an answer to protests against 2 very different theaters that portrayed ethnic identity on stage with the portrayal of black characters by white actors wearing makeup, Sherman Longhof was tapped to ascend to the artistic directorship of the Maxim Gorky Theater, one of Berlin's 5 state and municipally funded theaters, and she can now look back on her first season as artistic director at having founded and brought together the most ethnically diverse ensemble of actors in the country, focusing not only on new work, but also on renderings of German and world classics. My work at English Theatre Berlin Internationally Performing Arts Center is also intended to give credence to the incredible diversity in the city through a largely late 20th and 21st century phenomenon that English has become the 21st century lingua franca, fulfilling in many ways the same role that French did in the 19th century. And so with an institution like English Theatre Berlin, this has led to a transition from producing plays within the canon of US, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African playwrights to a focus on truly international work that can only be created by artists from a vast diversity of background of artistic practices and traditions, building work using English as a working language. For example, we recently presented a production at the theater called The Emigrants, Prisoners of Freedom. This piece, created by a Serbian director and a Hungarian journalist and video maker, was in and of itself a reworking of a Polish play from 1974 by Vladimir Mrożek called The Emigrants, which was radically adapted to the performers' own stories and backgrounds and presented on our stage in Hungarian, Serbian, English, and German. And what we're dedicated to doing now is functioning as a live art, producing and presenting organization, showcasing the internationalism that can only be built here. In addition to producing work inside our auditorium, we also take up themes that take place in our shared city. One example this year was the world premiere of a new play called Schwarz gemacht, Made Black, written by an African-American playwright, Alexander Thomas, married to a German foreign service worker. He found himself absolutely compelled by the fact that in her yearbook from her small town in Western Germany, he saw a picture of a classmate with a darker skin tone. He was automatically consumed by questions of identity. Who is this woman? Where is she from? What language does she speak? What were her experiences? His wife at first patiently, and then increasingly impatiently said, Alex, this woman was born in Germany. She grew up speaking German. She sees herself in German as much as I know. And over 10 years ago, the seeds of this conversation led Alex to pursue a decade worth of research into the fact that there has been an African presence in what we now call Germany for the last 500 years. And so he envisioned a play called Schwarz gemacht, Made Black, examining Afro-German identity in Berlin in 1938 during the National Socialist era, and contrasting that with the African-American experience in the United States in that same time, bearing in mind, in fact, that there was a century gap between the end of the US Civil War and the start of the US Civil Rights Movement. And so in this piece, we sought to look at another section of Germany's demographics that do not always see themselves represented in the stories and on the stages of a nation and its cultural institution. Hand in hand with this is outreach work, where we attempt to take our work outside of closed rooms and bring it into public space. Most of you have probably heard the term gentrification at one time or another in recent years. This is a term that generally has a negative connotation, probably rightly so, and refers to the phenomenon of changing cityscapes. Now, modern cities in the context that we live in today are a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution, that we all have some form of employment. Now there seems to be more or less international agreement that this gainful employment should last about 40 hours a week, should result in some form of wage, and that wage should be sufficient for urban dwellers to, more often than not, pay a fixed amount each month as rent and for permission to live in a space. What has been happening in global cities like New York, London, Paris, Berlin in recent times is that the cost of living in certain districts changes radically within short periods of time. For example, Berlin. We can all probably agree that Berlin has an unmatched history in terms of the 20th century. Completely and utterly decimated in World War II, only to be split in half 4 years later, finally reunified 25 years ago in 1989. When the wall finally came down and the city was reunified, everything was different. The district in West Berlin, the traditional guest worker neighborhoods of Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and Wedding, all of a sudden became seemingly picturesque waterfront properties because the Berlin Wall was no longer standing and there was no longer an armed German border in between. Within these 25 years, so during the time of walled West Berlin, an island 300 kilometers behind the Iron Curtain, these three neighborhoods were among the least desirable, which went hand in hand with those being the neighborhoods in which the new immigrants were settled. With the wall gone, set on the canal as Kreuzberg and Neukölln are, and set on a canal of the Havel as Wedding is, all of a sudden, these neighborhoods have become increasingly attractive to new demographic swatches. And these new demographies moving into these neighborhoods have then resulted in rising rental prices and a forcing of the old sections of the population out of these neighborhoods. Unfortunately, this is not a story that takes place in the German capital alone. As someone who lived between Brooklyn and Berlin from 2006 to 2012, I found myself observing almost in eerie real time as the processes of gentrification in Kreuzberg and Neukölln seemed matched by the same processes in Williamsburg and in Bushwick. Both sets of neighborhoods in the early 2000s, areas where perhaps well-meaning denizens of the cities would say, oh, maybe you don't want to go there. Maybe that neighborhood is a little rough. And of course, the first people to go into these neighborhoods from demographies other than immigrants who are set there tend to be visual artists who are in pursuit of space to pursue their practices, who need sculptors, painters, people who need a great deal of space and don't have a lot of money to pay for it. Once they have come along and started to establish their work, started to build a bit of a community amongst themselves, it tends to be reported. Other types of demographics, other swaths of the population tend to become aware. And as this happens, then developers become aware, then larger blocks of housing begin to be converted, vacant lots may be renewed and built over. And so one achieves full-scale demographic change, sometimes in periods as quickly as 4 or 5 years. One project that English Theatre Berlin International Performing Arts Center will be doing to examine this process of gentrification is a project called Rückzug in die Zukunft, which is the German title for a series of films known as Back to the Future. And in 2015, the year of the future, 30 years after 1985, we will look at Berlin-Neukölln and neighboring communities in Graz and in Mulheim with a bilingual production taking place in English and in German, looking at the fact that while I, and I would assume those of you from the UK, know the film as a film from the United States called Back to the Future, it's known in Germany as a US film with German subtitles and a different title called Zurück in die Zukunft. And what we'll be doing in those three cities is we'll pursue our work outside of an auditorium, and we'll do it inside a storefront, which tend to be the first types of properties that are repurposed when neighborhoods undergo whole-scale demographic change. And one can see, for example, a call center or an internet cafe become replaced with a cupcake cafe or a designer furniture store. And in neighborhoods undergoing wholesale demographic change, one often observes a new economy being formed and taking place whose goods and services may not be of any interest, utility, or within the economic purchasing power of the original and extant community. And what we'll do is inside these storefronts, we'll create a site-specific performance intended to look, reflect, and pose questions on what it means that cityscapes change. Is it a wholesale bad thing? How can governments, which in theory are elected by the people and for the people, how can they participate in ensuring that all citizens are treated equally and that some citizens are not treated more equally than others? Thanks for your time and attention.
So what I would like to do now is to open up the floor to any questions that you might have for any of our panelists, either about changing landscapes, about Britain, or any other questions you might be interested to know the answer to. So,
I'm glad you mentioned the riots, because after the riots there was an interview about British youth culture, and I think it was David Starkey that said something about how whites were becoming black. And even though was it niece or nephew that enjoyed Rasta Mouse?
My nephew.
Oh, even though your nephew enjoys Rasta Mouse, he was complaining about like how patois was becoming like more mainstream. So what do you guys think about that? And also I had a question for you. You kept talking about accommodation, integration, openness. But do you think that it's maybe to do with toleration? Like we just put up with one another? Because just because Asda, Waitrose, Sainsbury's sells halal samosas, maybe we're not as multicultural as the rest of the world sees us?
Yeah, I think about the question about English language. I think it's a constantly mutating thing, you know, like you mentioned, we've been conquered by the French, so we naturally had to take in so many French words. If you wanted to be a success, you had to speak French, otherwise it wasn't hopeful. So I think disdain for any new influences is just outmoded. It's not going to be the voice of history. Like, language just changes as it sees fit. You know, whatever is the best word or the most useful or convenient words in a certain situation, people are going to use that. So you can't really make a rule on don't speak like this, don't speak like that. Just over time, like, language will just go the way it wants anyway. It's very organic.
Yeah, in response to your question directed at me, I think I would argue that perhaps, yes, you're definitely right. There is definitely a case that there is, in some parts of Britain, in perhaps quite a lot of parts of Britain, migrant communities and second and third generations are tolerated as opposed to any active effort to integrate. However, I would argue that this is the gateway stage, so toleration can and often does lead to integration. So I would refer back to the broad sweep of history. And so I would argue that this is a process going on at the moment, but it's perhaps not happening as fast as we would like it to. I think, to make the point, I reckon the Anglo-Saxon population 1,000 years ago only tolerated as opposed to had any actual desire to integrate with the French aristocracy. And so it's just something that's forced by hundreds of years to occur. So hopefully it won't take that long this time around.
You got any more questions? I think it's very hot and everyone's keen to get Pimms. We've got one question there, Lindsay. Where's the mic? Oh, right. This one.
Someone had made a point about language before. There was an example. I used to work in hotels and things in England for about 10 years, and England, as I think a lot of people know, we had a very big influx of Polish workers. They all came to England. and there was a housekeeping manager, and instead of expecting her staff to be speaking English, she found that the best way to be able to communicate them was she herself taught herself Polish so that she could speak to her staff and they would feel more comfortable. But as far as I'm aware, that doesn't seem to be the normal thing that happens in England. A lot of us, when we come over here and we have to work, like I'm just starting to work and I need to have a proficiency exam, but do you think that that's something that should be brought into England, or do you think that it's maybe we should be learning to educate ourselves of the languages of people that are coming to visit us and work in England?
Maybe I'll say something as a non-Brit. With questions of migration, one of the first terms I found myself questioning was the notion of an expatriate versus the notion of an immigrant. And as far as I can tell, the one etymological difference between the two is that a so-called expatriate, a term that not for nothing was coined during the age of the British Empire, refers to somebody who leaves their country of origin of their own free will to pursue their own happiness or self-realization, whereas an immigrant is traditionally defined as someone who in some way, shape, or form is forced to leave their country of origin, be it through warfare, be it through persecution, be it through economic necessity. And as someone born and raised in the United States, I grew up in a region where the few immigrants I came into contact with were people from Mexico, Central and South America who traveled north up to the frozen reaches of upstate New York to work in fields during our slightly less Arctic summer. And I always found anyone claiming that these incredibly hardworking people doing work that none of my neighbors would do, working 12 hours a day, would find the time to pursue intensive language study on the side. In Germany, it's an interesting phenomenon. Immigrants, I live here, I intend to spend the rest of my life here. I've lived here for 13 years, it's over a third of my own existence. I happened to achieve a college degree before I came over, because in the States we do our degrees from 18 to 21, and it's more or less a cultural obligation these days across almost all classes and demographies. Because I happened to achieve a university degree, and we can argue what it was worth, I was exempted from a so-called Integrationskurs. German law dictates that if you have the equivalent of a university degree, then you don't have to demonstrate or prove your language proficiency in order to receive a residency permit. But for everyone else, they do. And I think, in terms of your question, it makes a lot of sense to me to hear in this situation, Polish people are probably not emigrating to Britain for the weather. There's dire economic necessity, and it's wonderful that the European Union exists and that there are modified forms of Schengen that allow the free movement of goods and people. But in this case, where there is an imbalance in terms of privilege, I think it absolutely makes sense for those from comparably richer countries to make sure that they work harder with their language acquisition. I mean, even within Europe, when you look at the Scandinavian countries, and this seems to be primarily because they do not dub their media products, but the global media products that are consumed by all are consumed in native languages with subtitles. If you look at those language proficiencies compared to Germany and France, the two largest economies of the European Union, you'll still see that the Nordic countries have a much higher proficiency with both US and UK English as well as global English. And I think those are my 2 cents on the matter.
I think with British people's reluctancy to learn language, I think coming from Lancashire, coming from a small town, if you go to the next town and they ask you, are you local? And you say, yeah, I'm from down the road. There's like, you're not local. And that's reflected in even your accent, even the words you choose, the slang you use. It's a kind of point of pride. Your accent tells you where you're from. It tells others where you're from. And if that's accents, that's the English language, and we feel so differently about other people who speak our own language, I think maybe there's a fundamental matter of pride. We feel we're English, we don't need to learn other languages. And I think that really needs to be considered and looked at from a really early age in schools. I think education is the key.
Have we got any further questions? Either on, oh, one at the back. Do we have another mic? Darnell, could you take it maybe to the gentleman in white?
Hello. I'd just like to go back to the point you were talking about with education, because I work as a primary school teacher in London, and we get a lot of children coming in, learning lots of different cultures, lots of different languages, and they assimilate very, very quickly, but there's no necessity within culture in the UK for children to learn another language. All their culture comes to them in English, the music, their TV, their films, their books, everything comes to them in English. And within the education system in England, there is no imperative put forward to learn a second language. I do about 20 hours of lessons a week in primary school. I'm lucky if I get 30 minutes to do French. I think it's a...
Wait a minute, just keep trying.
Okay. I find it a real shame because in every other way, the children in my primary school classes have always been really, really good at integrating with children from other cultures. The earlier age these children are, they don't see the differences between themselves. They will happily accept a new person who comes in from another country, who speaks no English, make friends with them, play with them. A couple of months later, the child is practically speaking English perfectly. And so I think there is a lot of integration that goes on in the UK. I think the problem comes, as someone mentioned before, there are totally different areas in the UK. So my primary school in London, about a quarter, sometimes even a third of a class might be non-native English speaking, non-native English or white English. But that might be totally different in a school out in the countryside or in another city somewhere. So this idea that there's a fusion of British and foreign culture, I think, happens in some places. I'm not sure it happens all over.